Hi everyone. I chose to do my project on shooting a free throw. I chose this topic because basketball is something that has brought me a lot of joy and something I feel super comfortable sharing with someone else. It's also very accessible. Basketball courts are practically found everywhere, but like in parks or in neighborhoods, and it's also an active and healthy hobby. For those of you who don't know what a free throw is, this bottom photo kind of shows what it would look like in a game. And this top photo shows the correct form and the many steps that are involved when shooting a free throw. The project outline that I used was gathering materials, collecting baseline, providing 2 teaching sessions, and a post-test. The materials that I needed were a laptop, gym, basketball hoop, paper, pin, basketball, and mask. These are my short-term objectives. The first one is that the client will identify 4 out of the 4 letters of BEEF with 1 verbal cue by the end of the second session. So this acronym BEEF is really important when shooting a free throw, and it really highlights the 4 main parts that are involved in shooting just in general. So I chose to use that acronym to base my whole entire teaching sessions off of. So I felt it was super important to know every single word. The second objective is that the client will make 1 free throw while correctly using 16 out of the 19 components with 1 verbal cue by the end of the second session. So this 16 out of the 19 components is just based off the rating scale. Here are our baseline procedures. I had 7 steps that I used and that I told the client to do. And the reason there's so many steps is because when shooting a free throw, there's many aspects that go into it. So I kind of had to have them slow down a little bit so I could score it correctly. This is the data that I received from those baseline. As you can see, I decided to do this like rating scale, and I split it up into 4 different parts, which is balance, eyes, elbow, and follow through, which are the main components of the acronym BEEF. This client practically had all 1s with a couple 2s for exceptions. And they also didn't know any of the words for BEEF, which is to be expected. It's kind of difficult to think of on the top of your head what it can mean. But the total points they had was 8, which is to be expected. And this little table over here just shows how many shots they made out of 10. I had the client shoot 10 shots after going through the first 7 steps. And this is just so I could kind of see if knowing the components related to accuracy of shooting. It had nothing to do with like goals or anything. So for the first lesson, this is my kind of outline. I put it in just these bullet points to talk about. The top 2 kind of just talks about the session objectives. And the bottom is the procedure. So I started by presenting a PowerPoint since it was virtual. And then I divided each section of the acronym down into balance, eyes, elbow, and follow through. So for each section, I provided a direct model, then allowed the client to copy it. And then I put all the steps together and showed a direct model, and then had the client copy it as well. And then after we went through that, the client would practice using correct form shooting a basketball without a hoop. So they'd just pick a spot on the wall or on the floor, and then we would add the hoop. This just gave the client some practice and actually feeling the correct way to shoot. And then the last part is that 10 baskets that I talked about in the last slide, and asked them to define BEEF. The visuals that I provided during this session was a PowerPoint, and this is just screenshots of different PowerPoint slides. This highlighted what the acronym BEEF meant, and it just was like a constant reminder of the words. And it also provided visuals, so this shows the correct foot placement, knee placement, elbow placement, and so forth. This kind of highlights what not to do versus what to do. This shows where to look on the rim, and this just shows the correct follow through. So I tried to add a visual that would help the client see the correct way to shoot. It also provided a visual schedule for us, which was super nice because The client knew what was coming next, and it helped me keep on track. This is the data that I received from, that I gathered from that first teaching session. The yellow is the baseline, the blue is the first teaching session, and the green is if they scored the same. As you can see, for the most part, the client actually improved. Besides, in this one, they just kind of stayed the same. They also defined 3 of the elements of beef. The one that they did not know for sure was foot forward. They used foot forward instead of follow through. And the total points they received was 15 out of 19. And they actually only made 2 shots this time instead of 3 versus baseline. So for lesson 2, the rationale was practically to stick pretty much the same. I printed out the visuals instead of having a PowerPoint presentation. I focused on areas that the client had difficulty with from the last session. And then I provided less modeling at first because I felt that I provided too much modeling in the beginning and didn't allow the client to show me the information they retained and what they already knew. So doing this, I thought, would create more independence and strengthen the client's confidence. For lesson 2, this was the lesson plan. It was pretty much the same. Where I changed is this step right here. I allowed opportunity for the client to demonstrate steps first, and then I provided the direct model for each step if it was even necessary. I found that the client did retain a lot of the information and didn't even need me to model. I also ended it the same way with shooting the 10 baskets and practicing. One other area I guess I forgot to mention that I changed was my goal changed a little bit for the second one. My first one it didn't because I thought that was pretty, I thought that was a good goal. But the second one, instead of 12, I went to 16 out of the 19 components because after the first teaching session, the client scored 15. So I thought that was an appropriate goal. And this just highlights how the client did. Purple is this second teaching session. And as you can see, the client improved in all these categories besides follow through. We received a couple ones here. And they identified all 4 of the elements. So this just shows the difference from baseline to the second teaching session. For the post-tests, I provided the same procedures, the same 7 steps as the baseline. And this is the data. Red is the post-test and yellow is the baseline. And as you can see, all these the client improved and got all of them correct. And the one component they missed was the F, which is follow through. And they said finish, which is also related to basketball. So when provided a verbal cue, the client did get 4 out of 4. So the total end goal was achieved because they received 18 out of 19. And they also made 5 of the 10 baskets, which you can see right here, compared to their 3. So there could be some relationship, it's not really certain, between accuracy and knowing the correct form. This just shows basically the data that I just showed you, but in a graph. Here's baseline and here's post-test. So from this whole entire experience and project, I learned the importance of preparing a lesson plan ahead of time and actually putting in a lot of thought and detail. I realized that understanding having too much support can have a negative effect. It made me realize I need to step back and see what my client needs before assuming they need certain support or prompting. I also noticed that being flexible and being able to adjust on the spot is something that I probably need to work on a little bit more. It's okay if it doesn't go as planned, and just being able to change it so it does continue to work. And then lastly, I learned the importance of looking over the first lesson plan and adjusting for the second one. I did this by seeing what kind of modeling needed to happen or didn't need to happen. And I think realizing what worked and what didn't work and actually implementing into your next session was super important. So I definitely learned a lot from this experience, and I really enjoyed it, and I thought it gave me a really good insight on what it takes to prepare a lesson plan. Thank you for listening.